everybody to our first Friday Creatinine Science webinar. This month we're very honored to have two speakers, Ben Rook, now affiliated with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and Yu-Chun Kao, affiliated with USGS. We paired these two talks in some ways because they're studying, of course, common fishes, common creatinines, but also I think it's unusual and they've exploited historical data to try to make sense of some of the patterns that we're seeing today. And of course, the dogs are barking, sorry about that. And so they're going to take us back in time to the early 20th century. And both of them have the common theme of our Cisco and Lake White, well, the common theme of competition, really. With different species. Ben's going to start us off our Cisco and Lake Whitefish competitors, an analysis of historical fisheries in Michigan waters of the Upper Great Lakes. Ben got his bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife management at Lake Superior State University, got his master's degree in natural resource management from UW-Stevens Point. And each of their talks is going to be between 20 and 25 minutes. And at the end of both talks, we will open it up for questions. So Nick will probably mute you and me as soon as these talks begin. And then once we're ready for the question and answer period, use the raise hand function or submit a question to the chat. And hopefully we'll have a good discussion and set of questions after these talks. So with that, Ben, I yield the floor to you.
I'll go ahead and get started. So kind of the premise of this project are some questions related to differences in what we see in some of the historical harvests, mainly in the 70s and then early 80s and 90s between Cisco and then Lake Whitefish. So the idea here is to go back and look at what we have available in some of the historical data sets to explore potential evidence of competition between these two species. Before I get into the bulk of the presentation, I just kind of wanted to put a study area slide up just for anybody that's not real familiar with a lot of the historical management units and where we're actually working for the data set we have. So the little inset up in the corner shows Michigan waters of the Upper Great Lakes. So we're just going to be working with Superior, Michigan, and Huron. And then we're going to be working with historical commercial fishery management units. So these are a little bit different than what everybody's probably used to seeing nowadays. But this is just the historical statistical districts and how everything was summarized in terms of commercial fishery data and how everything was reported, back up until about 1970. And we kind of switched over after that, moving on into the 80s and then 90s. So a little bit of background, historically, Cisco and Lake Whitefish were abundant throughout the Upper Great Lakes, but overharvest, habitat degradation, and then interactions with exotic species caused most populations to collapse or decline by the mid-1900s. For Cisco, this was primarily related to overharvest in all three lakes, and then eutrophication and pollution in Green and Saginaw Bays and Lakes Michigan and Huron. For Lake Whitefish, primarily overharvest, again, in all three lakes, and then predation from sea lamprey in all three lakes as well. If we take a look at annual harvest in millions of kilograms, this particular figure is kind of a good example for all three lakes. I've got all of them combined for all jurisdictions, but it really kind of shows what was going on historically. It's really representative of each individual lake for the most part. What we saw were that harvests of both species declined anywhere from about 93 to 100% in each lake from historical highs in the late 1800s and early 1900s to all-time lows by the 1950s and 1960s. I've got 70s down here on my notes for Cisco, but that's really kind of the product of this figure is Cisco holding on just a little bit longer in Lake Superior. What you see in Lakes Huron and Michigan are Cisco were basically extirpated throughout the bulk of their historical range by about 1955 or 1960. Superior a little later, and we did have larger populations that held on much longer. Cisco partially recovered in Lake Superior after the early 1980s, but despite improved environmental and ecological conditions, and some of the lower Great Lakes. The small remnant stocks that were present in northern Lake Michigan and northern Lake Huron have really failed to recover. They've shown limited signs, but harvested remain low or not allowed. In contrast, what we saw with Lake Whitefish were that they had this spectacular recovery throughout all three lakes, and then harvest increased to record levels after the 1980s. So if you kind of take a look at this red arrow here, that's what we're talking about. You sort of have these horrible low population levels around 1960, and then everything starts this, miraculous recovery. And then by 1980, early 90s, late 90s, 2000s, we're kind of at all-time highs. So record harvests for Lake Whitefish were related to sea lamprey prey control primarily. And then we have the reaffirmation of treaty fishery rights, and then the fact that Lake Whitefish were really the only major commercial species left in the Great Lakes. At this point in time, lake trout were basically gone. On Lake Superior, Cisco and Lake Whitefish populations increased simultaneously during about 1978 to 1998. But what we saw in Lakes Michigan and Lake Huron are these differential responses from each species. So despite these improved environmental and ecological conditions, we have these differential responses, and this has really led to questions about potential competition between the two. These questions are primarily based on the harvest data since the 1970s, so I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. We sort of have this disparity between what we see for Cisco harvest and Lake Whitefish harvest here, kind of outlined by this red arrow. And then we also have a few mesocosm experiments that really suggest that, when you put these two species close together in a confined space, there's potential for competition during the larval stage. A lot of these questions kind of ignore the fact that both of these species have coexisted for thousands of years, and they're really adapted to avoid competition. And they also ignore the fact that overharvest for Cisco anyway was really concentrated on spawning aggregations. And on top of that, we also had some very severe localized habitat degradation, mainly pollution and then eutrophication in Green and Saginaw Bays. So we have kind of these widespread Cisco extirpations going on during the mid-1950s as well. Typically what you see are these Lake Whitefish harvests recovering anywhere from 10 to 20 years after Cisco are basically extirpated from these individual areas. So a little bit of background on some of the adaptations for both of these species. Cisco, terminal mouth, pelagic. They live and feed in the water column, and they're primarily targeting zooplankton prey. Lake Whitefish, subterminal mouth, benthic, live and feed near the bottom. And then historically, they would have been targeting Diparia. Now it's kind of a mixed bag based on what's out there. So just kind of in summary, they have these adaptations that allow them to take advantage of different environments and different food sources. So during the adult stage, pretty good segregation in space, and then also during the larval stage, pretty good segregation in space as well. So we don't really have a whole lot of studies where the ranges of these two species overlap, but where we do have them, like in northeastern Lake Ontario, we see that the bulk of a lot of the larvae on the pelagic portion of the water are offshore, going to be 95% Cisco, and then near shore 84% Lake Whitefish. And if you go and you look at the individual studies for these species where they don't overlap, you kind of see the same trend, but again, not a whole lot of areas where we can actually go through and look at this. So I just want to point out the importance of embayments to Cisco compared to Lake Whitefish. So if we take a look at what we have for just data from the state of Michigan waters, the three bays I have labeled here, Keweenaw Bay, Green Bay, and then Saginaw Bay, contributed about 75% to Cisco harvest historically prior to 1970, and only about 25% to Lake Whitefish harvest. So Keweenaw Bay was 70% in Michigan waters of Lake Superior. Green Bay was up around 90%, and then Saginaw Bay was 70%. So one of the things that's important to point out here is that we do have quite a bit of excessive eutrophication and pollution going on in both Green Bay and Saginaw Bay. So we're likely seeing a really disproportionate effect of that on Cisco compared to Lake Whitefish as well. So some of the current stocking programs going on for Cisco, the main one is in Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron, where the minimum plan is about 750,000 fingerlings per year for the next 10 years. I think we're in year 4 or 5 of that. Last number I saw was somewhere around 1.2 million. So 750,000 is kind of the minimum. These large-scale restoration stocking events are kind of ongoing in Saginaw Bay, and they're being discussed or deliberated for some other areas of the Great Lakes, but they're still kind of in the early stages. Kind of the goal behind stocking Cisco is to provide a more stable, locally adapted forage base for predators, and then also to kind of reconnect offshore productivity with the nearshore zone, which we've kind of lost given some of the invasive species that everything's relying on today. One of the questions that still remains is kind of this, is there an interaction between these two species? And, what you find when you go in and you look at what's available for contemporary data to kind of address this question is very, very limited, both spatially and temporally. But what we do have is a long-term commercial fishery data set that could be used to kind of take a first look at this. So it is fishery dependent data, and it's kind of subject to all the caveats of that, but it is a very large spatially and temporally diverse data set as well. And the general approach is just going to be very simple correlation analysis. So again, I want to put the study area up again, just kind of remind everybody where these historical commercial fishery management units are. And basically what we're going to do is a very simple correlation analysis, and then we're going to bring in a spatial component too, where we're going to group everything together. We're going to do models for each individual management unit, each individual lake, and then regions within each individual lake. So if we move to the objectives, they were to use historical commercial fishery data to test for evidence of potential interactions, whether it be positive or negative, between Cisco and Lake Whitefish. For this, we're using harvest data from Jensen and Butner 1976, corrected for effort and catchability. So it's basically just a CPE index. For effort, basically length of gill nets, and then catchability, we're correcting for changes in gill net efficiency over time. So gill nets were the one gear that was kind of consistently used to target both species throughout the historical fishery, but each fishery was prosecuted individually. So you have separate Cisco and Lake Whitefish fisheries. Linen and cotton gill nets were used early on in the time series, and then everybody kind of transitioned to more efficient materials as they became available. So nylon multifilament and then nylon monofilament gill nets. So we have these increases in catchability over time, and when you go through and do the math on it based on what's available for studies, what we're using, later on in the time period around 1970 is roughly about 5.5-fold more efficient than what was being used early on in the time series. So we're controlling for as many changes in catchability as we possibly can. And then also we want to go through and test for spatial differences. So we're going to allow for different commercial fishery management unit groups within each lake. And this is important because interactions between these species may not be the same everywhere. There may be some regional differences. There's some lake-wide differences. So we want to use what we know about the past, our study period being 1929 to 1970, to inform future management decisions. And it's important to point out that this is really the only available data set with a wide range of contrasting abundances and then broad spatial and temporal coverage. Once you get past the mid-1900s, especially after 1970, Cisco are basically gone throughout most of their former range. So this is kind of what we have to look at right now. And then I do want to mention that the data quality generally decreases after about the 1950s with more limited commercial fisheries for both species. And then you start to see these localized Cisco extirpations showing up in different management units as well. So I kind of touched on this earlier, just using a very simple correlation analysis, Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. So this is the normal one everybody uses. It's just a measure of the direction and then the strength of a relationship. It ranges from -1 to 1. Anything close to 1 is relatively strong. Anything close to 0 is relatively weak. Anything negative just kind of indicates two species are trending differently. And then anything positive indicates that two species are trending similarly. So I do want to mention with this particular approach, it's important to note that correlation analyses can establish cause and effect. So basically what we're doing is we're using this to detect the result of something. We can't really say what's causing it. But what we would expect are positive correlations if large-scale environmental variables like temperature, wind speed, or ice cover were driving recruitment trends for both species. And then we would expect negative correlations to show up if competition or predation from one species were limiting the other. And I mentioned earlier, we want to take a look at different spatial arrangements of these commercial fishery management units because some of these relationships could vary based on region. So basically what we did is we put together 13 different spatial models based on CPE from all 20 units. We have a global model where we're basically fitting one set of correlation coefficients to every single commercial fishery management unit. We have a simple model where we're combining all the data from each commercial fishery management unit and then fitting one set of correlations. We have a lake-wide model. So basically each individual lake data is combined, and then we're looking at that. And then we have 10 different regional models. So regional models included a variety of a priori, nearest neighbor, and then regional groups. And really what you can do is go through and look at trends in CPE for both species, and you can say, hey, these are kind of behaving similarly. Let's kind of group these together. Take that approach. All CPE data were log-E transformed and then standardized or z-scored to meet assumptions of normality prior to analyses. And then we're going through and using the AIC-C statistic, which is just a small sample size correction for model selection. And then for our best fit model, we're just taking our correlation coefficients and then a model-wide p-value of 0.05 and applying Bonferroni corrections. So for a global model, it's just a p-value of 0.05 divided by 20. And then for our simple model, it's just a straight p-value of 0.05 because we're only using one correlation. So on to some results. Before I dive into these too much, I just kind of want to point out that light colors represent lake-specific best fit regional groups. We had to put this figure together for grayscale publication. So we couldn't get too in depth about differences between individual lakes. So basically anything you see within each lake that's the same color is the same regional grouping, but it may not be the same or behaving similarly to the same color in other lakes. So basically lake-specific regions. So our best fit model had a 90% probability of being the correct model of all models considered. And when you went through and looked at all the other ones, there was less than a 2% probability that anything else was the best fit model. So we had these east-west management unit groups in Superior, and then these north-south management unit groups in Huron. So if we take a look at Superior, moving from west to east, MS1 was kind of on its own, doing its own thing. MS2, MS3, and MS4 were grouped together, and MS5 and MS6 were grouped together. If we take a look at Lake Michigan, we have the whole northern portion of the lake grouped together. We have the central portion of the lake grouped together, and then the southern portion of the lake grouped together. And then similar kind of spatial arrangement for Lake Huron, where MH1 is on its own, doing its own thing. Then we have the central portion of the lake grouped together, and then the southern portion of the lake grouped together. So basically, nearest neighbor commercial fishery management units are kind of behaving similarly, at least as far as correlations between Cisco and Lake Whitefish go. So if we take a look at some scatter plots for our best fit model, which again was this regional model 10, kind of try and describe these a little bit so you can follow them. We use z-scores for everything. So we have Cisco z-scores on the y-axis, and then we have Lake Whitefish z-scores on the x-axis. And then everything's going to be centered around 0 in these plots because they were standardized. So we have the different regions for Lake Superior across the top, Lake Michigan across the middle, and then Lake Huron across the bottom. So if we take a look at the results as a whole, we only had 4 significant regional correlations. These corresponded to p-values less than 0.006. 3 of them were positive, and then 1 of them were negative. The significant positive correlations were all a result of concurrent declines of both species during the mid-1900s. So basically you saw Cisco and Lake Whitefish trending down at the same time, and then none of those populations recovered. This is fairly obvious when you go back and look at the CPE data for those particular units where you see the green plus signs. And then our significant negative correlation was this central Lake Huron region with MH2, MH3, and MH4. If you go through and look at the CPE figures for these particular management units, I think the negative correlation is most likely the result of Cisco extirpations or very near extirpations occurring in these individual management units as Lake Whitefish are starting to recover. But it's a little bit less obvious than what you see for the ones with positive correlations. I thought for comparison purposes, it would be a good idea to show some of the simpler models based on some larger data sets. So again, same kind of setup. We have Cisco Z-score on the y-axis and then Lake Whitefish Z-score on the x-axis. For our lake-wide model, we basically have one set of plots for each individual lake. So Superior, Michigan, and Huron. And then our simple model, we have all three lakes combined. So what we see are weak but significant positive correlations for the simple model, which is all three lakes combined, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner. And then also weak but significant correlations for Lake Superior and Lake Michigan in the lake-wide model. Basically, these are significant because we have sample sizes ranging from about 240, 250 data points to 660 data points. I think everybody can kind of look at these and they just look like a shotgun pattern. There's not a whole lot going on there. It's just kind of a product of how many data points we had that's kind of driving the significance there. And then we don't have any significant correlation for Lake Huron. So overall, not a whole lot going on with anything. So in summary, limited evidence of any interactions between Cisco and Lake Whitefish based on what we have available for historical commercial fishery data. There is the potential for some negative interactions between these species on a regional scale that does require further investigation. But only 1 in 9 of the regional correlations was negative and it wasn't very strong. Environmental and ecological conditions have changed in all three lakes. And more recent conditions could allow for negative interactions between these species, especially in Lakes Michigan and Huron. So kind of thinking about reduced productivity and then establishment of zebra and quagga mussels here. And then I do want to point out that some of these large scale Cisco restoration stocking events in Saginaw Bay may provide an opportunity for further investigation, but we're looking at decades out. So this is kind of what we have to work with right now as researchers and managers. So some acknowledgements here. Funding was provided by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. All the commercial fishery data were collected by the old Bureau of Commercial Fisheries, which is now the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then Jensen and Butner 1976 kind of summarized all of this. So it's kind of like a nice, neat package for a lot of this historical data for people that are interested in using it. And apparently we are taking questions at the end, so I will turn that over to Nick and Bo.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Thanks, Ben. If you have a burning question, yeah, let's clap. You can do your virtual clap. Very interesting. It's great. You could take advantage of those historical data, Ben. And if you want to not lose your questions while they're still fresh, go ahead and put them in the chat. But for now, for the sake of time, so we can potentially have more of a discussion and questions later, let's go through Yu-Chun's talk. So Yu-Chun Kao got his bachelor's actually in agricultural engineering from National Taiwan University. He got his master's in environmental systems. It was a mouthful for me to say. Also at National Taiwan University, and then got his PhD in resource ecology management from University of Michigan. Yu-Chun is with us at USGS Great Lakes Science Center, and he'll be talking today about some historical data from the 1952 to 62, as you see there in his title. And through those, not looking for evidence for a competition between whitefish and Cisco, but Cisco and non-native smelt and alewife. So take it over, Yu-Chun.
Thank you, Bo. Thanks for the introduction. I am Yu-Chun Kao, and first I want to use this slide to show my appreciation to the scientists before me and all my colleagues contributed to this project. Then also thanks for Ben's introduction. I don't really need to talk too much about Cisco in the upper Great Lakes. So for this slide, the only thing I want to highlight is our study period between 1952 and 62. Just happened to be the time when the Cisco commercial fisheries collapsed in Lakes Michigan and Huron. So you can see that here. So that gives us an opportunity to explore whether these invasive planktivores contributed to the declining abundance of Cisco in this period, because we have data. So some background, what we already know about the Cisco distribution in the upper Great Lakes. So based on our previous study, we analyzed another big data set from collected from the then US Bureau of Commercial Fisheries in Lake Michigan. And here I am showing a map generated from that study, showing the seasonal distribution of Cisco in Lake Michigan. The big takeaway from that study include first, bays were more important. You can see much higher distribution in Green Bay and the Grand Traverse Bay. And then secondly, there was a seasonal pattern. So Cisco's concentrated in the depths between 20 to 70 meters in summer, and they were more near shore in fall and spring, although the spring trend was less clear, basically was not significant in the model. So this is what we knew about Cisco distribution in the 30s. So then we think if that basically tells us in the 50s, when we look at the depth distribution of the upper Great Lakes and the bays, then we would expect to see higher Cisco abundance in these bays and in these shallower waters between, say, this green and the light green area. And we also expect to see some of Cisco's in the light blue area, but definitely not too much in the dark green area, because those could be too deep. Then Ben also covered much of the upper Great Lakes. So specifically in our study period, there are several important points to mention. So the commercial fisheries were stressed. So you can see some abandoned ship because of various reasons, including overfishing, habitat degradation, and invasive species. And in that period, we also see much higher traffic states. So the lakes were more eutrophic than what they are today. But if you want to look at water quality problems, that water quality problem is still more localized. We saw reports here and there, but did not see a widespread water quality degradation across all the 3 upper Great Lakes. And most importantly, in this period, we started to have this explosion of invasive species, especially alewives. Rainbow smelt had established, but their abundance did not reach the same high level as alewives. These 2 photos give you some idea about how big the catch could be and how big the 2 species were at that time. So the general objectives and in this study, we try to understand the distribution of Cisco in the upper Great Lakes between 1952 and 62. Because this data set is unique and the fisheries collapsed in the study period, we are also assessing the evidence for either any of these 2 planktivores have contributed to Cisco's declining abundance. Our general approach here is to analyze fisheries independent data collected by the research vessel Cisco. So this data set is very large, so including 8 to 12 cruises per year, mostly between April and November, and a lot of gillnet lifts, including 488 bottom set gillnet and 86 oblique set. So oblique set means the gillnets were set obliquely from the surface to the bottom. So it is really a whole water column sampling method. And this data set also include 919 bottom troll toes and also some mid-water troll surface. However, the surface quality was not very good. Most of the time, they did not catch any fish, so we did not include those data in this study. This data set also include the length, weight, sex, and maturity data for about 4,000 Cisco individuals. So just to give you some idea about the sampling station and the sampling effort distribution. So in Lake Superior, most of the surveys were conducted in 53 and 59, and most of the stations were relatively close to shore, although some of these stations are really deep. And in Lake Michigan, we have the most comprehensive data. So it covered, the surface covered the whole lake and a lot of sampling effort. And in Lake Huron, the surface were mostly in Saginaw Bay in 1956, although a small data set was, so yeah, just some small sampling effort in North Channel in 1952. So the method here, our goal was to generate two kinds of maps. If we have enough data, we generate predict maps. And if the data could not support the modeling effort, we just generate the data maps. So for predictive maps, we have enough data to do that for Cisco catch based on gillnet survey data. It is because the survey has been most relatively consistent. So consistent in terms of fishing method and the fishing gear. And we could not do that for alewife and rainbow smelt because of low catch rate in this data set. The method here, so is generalized additive models or GANs. So this method has been well documented in textbooks. I would not get into the details here. So generally, our steps first was generally we use the backward model selection method. And then we have a full model developed from in previous study. We just took that model from the Lake Michigan study. The first thing we did in this model selection algorithm is to test whether data from these two periods can be combined. So overall, the full model was really large. It include for a categorical variable period for us to test whether model data can be combined. And then other spatial distribution variables, including season, basin, base, or open waters, a function for depth, a seasonal adjustment for depth, and spatial autocorrelation. So you can think of these lines are the terms for us to build a map. And then finally, here are the terms for us to adjust for fishing effort that include the different type of set, including bottom and oblique, different mesh size, different night of sampling, and then finally an offset variable for gillnet area. So for our data maps, we use bottom trail catch data, and then we use maps to present, again, CPUE data. So we could not model bottom trail data because we don't know how to standardize catchability of the numerous types of trail used in that study period. So we counted there were at least 23 different trails used. So we just used a very simple method to standardize the fishing. To standardize the catch by fishing effort, so catch per unit area, and the area was calculated as the head rope length of the trail multiplied by the distance towed. So first, let's talking about the results. It comes to the model selection. So in Lake Superior models could explain about 60% of the deviance. So because of the period was a significant variable, so we built two models for each period, and the full model was selected. So the final model has a form, looks like this. And then for the Lake Michigan, the model could explain about 52% of deviance. So period was not significant, so data were combined just to build one model. However, the highlight is really here. The categorical variable basin was not significant. So it was saying Green Bay and the main basin was not, the catch rate were not significantly different after adjusting for fishing effort. And the set made different type of sets, made a little difference, bottom set and oblique set. So if you fishing through the whole water column, or you're just fishing at the bottom, also made no difference based on the model. So these two variables were not included in the final model, and the final model looks like this. And then finally, when it comes to the Saginaw Bay model, that's where we have enough data for Lake Huron. So only sample in 56, so we didn't even have a period. However, we also could not include a season in this model because the catch rate was really low in spring, mostly 0, and all 0 in summer. So basically there were no catch in spring and the summer. So we could only build a model for the data collected in fall. And again, bottom set versus oblique set was not, there was no significant difference in catch rate. So the final model is really simple, like this. That is also not surprising to explain about 70% of deviance, because this is really a smaller data set. So here I'm going to show you the predictive maps generated by using our generalized additive models. So first I'm showing the map for Lakes Superior and Michigan in the period between 59 and 62. So Superior map in the first period between 52 and 53 were very similar to these three, just having lower catch rates. So I am not showing those there for the sake of time. So spring, summer, and the fall, and relative and the different predicted catch in the lake. So the big take home here is this catch. First, this catch is for the distribution for adult. You can see the length frequency distribution here. Most of them were large fish. So these maps are showing distributions for adult. In general, the catch were higher in Lake Michigan than in Lake Superior. And in terms of seasonal difference, in Lake Superior, spring had the highest catch, then summer, then fall. But in Lake Michigan, it's different. Fall was the season with the highest catch, then spring, then in summer. Then we look into more specifics about the depth distribution. So in Lake Superior, most of the Ciscos were in the shallower waters, say less than about 20 meters in bottom depth. But in summer, they were more concentrated in the depths between 10 to 50 meters. So if you zoom in to this nearshore area, you can see a dark green strip here, where the Ciscos were concentrated. And the most important findings in Lake Michigan is that they were kind of bimodal in fall. So in fall, you can see they were very near shore, and some of them were more offshore. But in between, you actually see lighter colors. So the distribution was actually bimodal. But in spring, they were more near shore, and in summer. So that's what we expect to see, because in previous study, we actually saw similar pattern in spring and the fall. They were more near shore. We did not see this offshore distribution in fall. And in summer, you can see very low catch rate. So not too much to learn from there. Finally, for the predictive Cisco catch in Saginaw Bay, they were concentrated in nearshore waters, but mostly in Outer Bay. And the fish, so one thing to note is that the fishery actually collapsed after this year. Then we look at the bottom troll data map. So in the first period, we can see we are seeing the first, so the same Cisco distribution, and the larger bubble means larger catch per unit effort, spring, summer, and fall, and also length frequency. So usually we think bottom troll catch could be an indicator of recruitment, because most of the time you get smaller fish. And this could be true in Lake Superior, although the sample size was small, but you can see there were a lot of small fish caught in Lake Superior. So in terms of Cisco recruitment, you can say Lake Superior still had some sizable recruitment in 52, 53. But generally the catch was rare in Lake Michigan, and those were all large fish, so probably suggesting no recruitment, and no catch in Saginaw Bay. Then we look at alewives. You can say, wow, they already established in Saginaw Bay, but not in Michigan and Huron. And if we look at the rainbow smelt data, they were already everywhere in all three upper Great Lakes, but the largest catch occurred in Saginaw Bay. Then in the second period, we found something different, something similar. So first, Cisco, there is no sign of recruitment because the catch were mostly large fish in all three. Well, in Lakes Michigan and Huron, there's no catch in Saginaw Bay. They did not collect data in Saginaw Bay. And the alewife and the rainbow smelt established in Lake Michigan. Smelt still kind of abundant in Superior, but alewife was not there. So here is the end of the result. What does all this mean? So first, we look at changes in Cisco distribution in Lake Michigan between the 30s and the 50s. So this is data from our the results from our previous study and the results from this study in 3 different seasons. So in the 50s, we don't see catches concentrated in the base anymore. And some Cisco actually were in the deeper waters in fall, not just like these, only in the near shore waters. So this phenomenon was also reported by Wright in a 1973 report for some observation in Lake Superior. So I think we have very strong evidence showing this is not an artifact. And then finally, the low catch rate in summer implied Cisco could become more pelagic or near shore in summer, because the fish must still be somewhere in the lake, and those 2 areas were not well covered by the surface. Then the second superior, for the superior data, the distribution was somewhat similar. I mean, near shore in spring and fall, and slightly concentrated at certain depths in summer. So similar to that in Lake Michigan in the 30s. So the caveat here, Cisco could have been more pelagic and offshore oriented, similar to what we thought for Lake Michigan Cisco in summer. So that could be also the sampling bias, because the samples they used mostly bottom gear, and and they did not really sample too far away in the open waters at that time. Finally, for Saginaw Bay, there's a rare spring and summer catch could mean several things. We don't really know. Here are some speculations. First, there's oxythermal constraint. So the habitat become worse and worse in the 50s. This is some evidence because you don't really see Cisco moving to the very inner bay area in Saginaw Bay. They were concentrated here in the outer bay area. Or there was a Saginaw Bay stock, but that stock collapsed before 52. So we have some evidence from the monthly commercial catch data. So you can see it's the high and the low. Usually the lowest point in the middle of the year was from the summer. So July and August. And you can see summer catch decreased to 0 in 55. And it was really low. You catch you catch really 10-ish kilograms in a month. So could be collapsed. Thus, collapse of the Saginaw Bay stock could be also a reason. And surely there could be also seasonal migration. So Cisco only use the bay during part of the year. They only use, that is, in fall. So in spring and the summer, they were more in the main basin. So our next slide is talking about the timeline, suggests the rainbow smelt was more a threat to Cisco recruitment and the fisheries than alewife. So this is really based on the timeline. So rainbow smelt invaded in the 20s, established in the 30s, but there was a massive die-off event in Lakes Michigan and Huron in the early 40s. So both of them reestablished their populations in both lakes, as you can see from our data. Then we look at alewife. Basically, they invaded these lakes later and established later based on our data. So when the Cisco recruitment collapsed based on our button drop data. It's really happened here. So you see LY established in Huron, but not really in Michigan. However, we saw the collapse of recruitment of Cisco in Michigan already from our button drop data. And finally, here the timeline when the fisheries collapsed. So these suggest rainbow smelt was more a threat to Cisco recruitment than LY. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, great job. Thanks very much, Yu-Chun. And we now do have time for a series of questions. This is when we invite questions via the chat or using the raise your hand function, which is gonna vary different, normally in your participants tab, could be in your reactions tab. So I see a few people have already figured that out. And let's start with some of the chat questions. The first one is going to be to Ben. Ben, maybe you saw this earlier from Robin DeBruni. Interested in correlation patterns in northern Lake Michigan and Huron. The northern Lake Huron management unit separated out from the rest of Lake Huron. Did you compare this management unit with the northern Lake Michigan management unit grouping to see if they were similar to each other?
Yeah, we did that in the preliminary analyses, and then nothing kind of real significant shook out there by combining that with northern Lake Michigan. So we just kind of to simplify everything, just went with individual lakes after that. But it was looked at initially.
Okay. Yu-Chun, maybe you can stop sharing your screen.
Oh, I thought I had stopped. Sorry.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
For sure not.
Yu-Chun, this is from Ben, so maybe you can get Ben too and ask him a question. So Ben's asking in your talk, were there any differences in sizes with when you showed those bimodal depth distributions in the fall? You know, some were deep, some were very near shore.
Right.
In Lake Michigan, were you able to look to tell anything about whether those animals differed in size, those that were deep relative to those that were shallow?
Yeah, I believe there is a difference. I just could not remember because in the historical report that was actually from you, Ben, they said that there was size difference and also sex ratio difference between the nearshore and the offshore populations. So I did look into that, and I found that was our findings was consistent with the report. But sorry, I cannot remember. But there was a difference.
Do you have like a hypothesis, Ben, like where the bigger ones would be?
I was just kind of thinking if there was any difference between spawning individuals versus immature individuals. And you know, that would kind of probably rear its head in the sex ratio differences too, I would think.
But if you are talking about mature, these are all mature because of the gear selectivity. So they only caught larger fish, but there's still a difference between the mature.
Okay, good. I don't know if Bruce or Chuck was first, but Bruce is first on my sort of gallery here. So Bruce, do you want to unmute and ask your question for Ben or Yu-Chun?
Sure. And this is just kind of a general question, but I guess if you have a restoration stocking program planned, I'm assuming that you have like an appropriate habitat and water quality with the hopes of having a naturally occurring rebuild of the population instead of just a put and take, and how long that might take as far as how many stockings that might be and so forth. Any thoughts on that?
I can kind of take that, I guess. So my take on this, based on some of the recruitment patterns in Lake Superior, is that, you know, you basically have to go for a bare minimum of 10 years to try and get lucky enough to have a recruitment event. If something, you know, if you do, you know, have an adult population that reestablishes itself there, you know, typically you're seeing, you know, anywhere from a decade in between recruitment events right now in Lake Superior. So I think you can expect that everywhere else right now. So I can kind of speak on the timeline for that. I mean, that would kind of be the bare minimum right now.
So again, then you're looking at the goal then would be naturally occurring rebuild. I know where I live in Lake Superior, you get year classes that are unpredictable and weather that is unpredictable and water temps that are unpredictable. So if you're saying, well, if we're going to do a stocking program, then we're looking at 10 years of stocking or take a halt and see what happens and so forth. I know there's no easy answer, I guess, but I'm looking at perhaps, again, a naturally occurring, eventually getting to a naturally occurring rebuild of the population. So there's no need to continue stocking. Would that be right?
Yeah, I think Lake Superior is probably a good example of what to expect from that, you know, as far as a time frame. That's kind of really the only thing we have to go off of right now.
Yeah, and that is the reintroduction program in Saginaw Bay that's now in its third or fourth year of stocking. There definitely is a 10-year minimum to, well, they're actually checking in at 5 years and then again at 10 years to try to assess the success given the variability in Cisco recruitment and unknown about the survivability of the stock fish, for example. So yeah, it definitely is a long-term program, I think, that's underway in Lake Huron. And the other thing you mentioned, Bruce, was sort of the quality, or you know, trying to understand from a broader perspective that the impediments or the stressors that caused the extirpation or the decline, making sure that those still aren't an impediment today. And so I think that sort of leads into Yu-Chun's talk, which contributes to maybe some of our knowledge about what was some of the part of the demise. And his speculation is that smelt were probably part of that. Habitat degradation may have been part of that given the increased productivity in Saginaw Bay in that time. But so those are all things that I think the managers and scientists in Lake Huron are speaking to, are thinking about. Do we have anybody from Lake Huron that's involved in the restoration program, reintroduction program, that wants to add to that? Dave?
Well, your summary was essentially correct. It's, and I put in the chat that it's really something of an adaptive management experiment with the goal of having them self-sustain eventually. It's certainly not a put, grow, and take type of planting. Saginaw Bay historically was one of the most important spawning and nursery grounds. So that's really why it's the release site, although it's really a central Lake Huron sort of restoration effort. It's not necessarily intended only to benefit Saginaw Bay. And, you know, 10 years would probably be the minimum with which the commitments have been made so far. And I expect that if we're seeing some signs of positive results, that it will be extended to try to capture some of that periodicity of those occasional strong year classes that will ultimately be necessary to really get it going.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And Dave's done some nice simulations that sort of look at the different scenarios and assumptions there that I've seen him give talks about too. All right, let's go to Chuck Bronny with his hand up. Chuck.
Yeah, thanks. This is for Yu-Chun. So given your results that were basically the product of mostly bottoms that year, I'm thinking of what's the next step to kind of, again, ground truth the distribution of these animals given the pelagic nature of our TD. I know Daniel has obviously done a lot of hydroacoustic surveys in Lake Superior, both in the fall and I believe in other seasons. Have you had a discussion with him on his findings, and if perhaps his are not as extensive enough? It seemed a logical next step would be seasonal hydroacoustic surveys in, let's say, pick a like Western Lake Superior, which would be logistically probably a real easy thing to do. Just throwing out an idea there. I've forgotten what the extent of the off spawning season surveys were there in the past.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We definitely talked about acoustics in Lake Superior. One of our co-authors is from Lake Superior, and Owen Gorman. So he talked about that. So I think currently, if you want to know more about Cisco abundance in offshore waters, it is kind of hard, in my opinion. I don't have any experience. But one thing I would suggest is actually sampling more often, especially if you want to have higher catch rates. You probably want to sample later in the year. If you look at our data, they sampled to the end of November and early December, and even mid-December. That was the time when they had the highest catch. So in Saginaw Bay, it was at the end of November. And then in Superior and Michigan, that was sometime even later. So that's the recommendation I would make. So Paul may have some more comment about that.
Yeah, I think Chuck's idea to talk to Dan is good, and I don't know to what extent. I don't know how many. I see Jason on my screen. You would know some about the Lake Superior program in the past, and probably still keeps in touch with what they're doing. Jason, you want to address that at all? You just pop your hand up, and if it's for a separate question or to follow up.
Yeah. So I was just looking at some old papers, and we did compare night acoustic estimates to day bottom trawls, and there was really no comparison for adult estimates, day versus night. It was orders of magnitude difference, both near shore and offshore. And so my question was, is there any evidence that the Cisco historically behaved differently than they do today in regard to the pelagic nature that we see in Superior? And maybe a more broad question, and maybe more philosophical, is matching the gear and the data we have to the questions we ask. And I just wonder how much we can infer about models built on bottom set gill nets or day bottom trawls for at least adult stages that appear to be pelagic strongly. So I know when data are there, it's really great to take advantage of them, but I'm wondering about square pegs and round holes type of thing, and how much can we infer what we're seeing from these models based on the model output versus what we know about the ecology of the critter. So
if I can just respond to Jason, I agree. I think this is an opportunity to craft a well-designed sampling program around the remnant populations in Lake Superior, which would actually show us, maybe not, it would show us what the animals is capable of doing now, given the stock size and the densities that are there. There's no other place really in the Great Lakes left where you could do that. It would be nice just to document that. I know commercial fishermen that are going out north of Devil's Island in the shipping channel and setting pelagically set gill nets for spawners in November and getting as many fish as they would, let's say, in closer areas. So they're there. The idea is to document that with the right gear at the right time of day and have a time series through the season. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, very good. I think one of the values, one of the surprising results to me was what Yu-Chun found in the fall to find, I mean, clearly there's definitely a bias of underrepresenting adult Cisco in a bottom set gear. And that would be the case for, I think both of the talks we saw today were based on more bottom set gears. But to find all of those offshore Cisco in Lake Michigan in the 1950s in the fall, that's very different than what we found in analyzing the 1930s Cisco data. So that was to me, that was one of the more interesting things.
I also want to add, when we were analyzing 1930s data, I feel the catch rate were still high enough. So it's really, the results were not really suggesting maybe they did not sample the gear did not sample the whole population, but still we had a very good representative there. However, in the 50s, that could be slightly different. I think, Randy Eschenroter, one of our co-authors in the former paper, also mentioned that Cisco in Lake Superior could be more pelagic historically. And that was reported in Kelt's monograph too. So I think there is a between lake difference. There could be also between periods difference.
Okay, good. Ben, did you want to comment on that before you went to a question from Titus in the chat?
I had a question for you, Chen. You know, when you go back through a lot of these historical Cisco references, especially for Western Lake Superior, they talk about these spawning migrations moving up and down the coast, you know, depending on where they're coming from. Did you see any evidence of that I'm kind of specifically thinking of Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron for kind of like a spatial change as the season progressed in the fall, or was that not something you could look at with that particular data set? And I'm kind of thinking with the stocking in Saginaw Bay, is there a potential where we get these fish once they are established, you know, where they're potentially migrating down the coast and, you know, we have a certain subset of the population kind of stopping along the way and potentially reestablishing new populations as well?
Well, that's maybe way too specific. We only have our data set was the Saginaw Bay data set was not that big. But the really big take home is you probably want to see them in the very near shore waters in the inner bay area. You can see the highest catch, and their highest catch in the outer bay. And then also you see the seasonal difference. So I think that has some implications for future management. You may want to think about your stocking location, and also future sampling locations for assessment.
All right, so Titus has a question. I think it's based mostly off your talk, Yu-Chun. He says that if Cisco stocking were to happen in Lake Michigan, similar to the current Saginaw Bay stocking in Lake Huron, would it be best to stock primarily in Green Bay, which would be supported by your 1930s data set, or in a mix of nearshore and the offshore, like you found in the 1950s?
That's an open-ended question, very hard to say. But if you are asking me, I would think probably start with Green Bay for a test. But if you want to stock in Green Bay, you probably also want to stock in further, say, outer Green Bay instead of based on what we learned from Saginaw Bay information. And in fact, in the 30s, we also found in more in the waters closer to the main basin of Lake Michigan, you had higher Cisco density in fall than really the really inner bay part of Green Bay. So I think given the historical importance and what we found in these two data sets, if you want to ask me to put a bet on this two locations, I probably would bet Green Bay.
Okay, that's good. I see Chuck's hand. Let me get a question from Daryl on the chat. So Daryl's picking up again on this, the fall Yu-Chun and getting Cisco's very shallow and very deep. And he's asking, is there a chance that the individuals in the offshore actually were one of the deep water Cisco forms that were misidentified as artifact?
I think people always had these speculations, and it really depends. However, some of these scientists were the most experienced Cisco researchers at that time. So, for example, Stan Smith was on the cruise. So we generally believe their identification.
Okay,
You know,
good.
there's plenty of accounts for Lake Superior where they talk about, you know, nearshore and offshore forms. So I don't think there's any reason to expect that wasn't going on in any of the other Great Lakes too.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, Chuck, got your hand up.
Well, I was just going to comment on the Green Bay, you know, suggestion. I mean, that's been suggested, you know, for a while. That would be the logical first place to go. So given what we know about the historical yield and where it came from, that would be the first place we would drop any Cisco if the Lake Committee would agree to that. But that has not been the case. The Lake Committee has kind of put a halt on not on thinking about it, but just any actions right now with regard to Cisco reintroductions.
All right, we are at 1:43, so over an hour, but again, we've been blessed to have good discussion, good questions. Do we have any more before we sign off for June? And I should say in July, we actually do not have a talk scheduled. The first Friday in July is July 2nd. Some of you, at least in the US, might be on holiday for the July 4th weekend. We could potentially bump it back 1 week later if somebody wanted to submit a talk in July. But if not, we'll just consider it our sort of holiday vacation from the webinar. We do have a really nice, interesting webinar set up for August by Randy Brown from Fish and Wildlife Service. He's going to be talking on bearing Cisco in Alaska. So a little bit different perspective I think might be really interesting to hear about bearing Cisco outside the Great Lakes, obviously. All right, any final questions that I haven't seen anywhere? Hands raised, chat.